Now, how I almost got fired for copyright. Most of you don't know anything about trademark law, and I didn't either when I came to TSR, but trademark law is a very kind of arcane and weird process. And in order to protect your trademarks and keep them enforceable so someone can't steal them, like we all remember when Xerox was the term for photocopying, and then Xerox said, no, Xerox is our brand name, and they went through this whole lawsuit in order to get people to say photocopying, and amazingly it kind of worked in the same way with Kleenex is facial tissue now. In order to protect the trademark, you have to use it properly, and it has to be exactly as you have trademarked or registered it. Now, as it turns out, Dungeons and Dragons, the trademark, is Dungeons ampersand, that G-looking sign, and Dragons. I wrote the back cover copy for the basic and expert books, the magenta, the red and blue ones. And as it turns out, no one had told me that D, was not a trademark, whereas D ampersand D or Dungeons ampersand Dragons was. They hadn't told me, they hadn't told anyone in the production department, which turned out saving my butt. So we had these press sheets, or proofs, I think they were probably just proofs, of the back cover copy. They were beautiful. And they went from our little building up to the executive building and ran through the legal department and with the other executives up there. And they came back, "You're going to lose us our trademark. You spelled out the word and." Who did that? We need to fire that person. And fortunately at that point, Harold Johnson, my boss, and Lauren Schick, his boss, stood up and said, "You know, no one ever told anyone in the building that produces this stuff that was true. You're just lucky that it hadn't happened before. So Steve didn't know, so you can't fire them." They were like, "Oh, all right, I guess we can't fire them, but you're costing us money and don't do it again." And that began what was a series of my self-protective style sheets that I used to put up on the wall. These were arcane things like never spell out the word "and" that you might never suspect, but that could get you fired. And I had like a list of those for each little project we worked on. So there was that, as I said, there was that tension between the upper management of the company and Gary, between him and the business partners, and between all of them and the creative division. And all we wanted to do was make games. We were living games. It was a great time. We would go in and work at TSR all day, and then after work we'd get together and we'd game. We'd play test. At the time I didn't think anything of it. They're really not paying us to do this. It was just so much fun, and the people we were working with were so cool. And of course that's what we were going to do. Very few of us were married at the time, and so there were no kids. There was Zeb Cook's child was born like right around the time I got there. And so we just worked constantly, and it was a blast. And so we weren't really concerned about the business end of the whole deal. And that included the editors and the designers, the Devo people, and the artists, all of whom, we were all a clan together in the one building, and everyone else was literally across town in another building. So there came a day where one of Gary's modules, I think it might have been S1, but I'm not sure. It was one of his modules went through the design production sequence where it came in, and because Gary was a designer, it went to Devo. And the Devo guys went through it and they gave it to editorial. And then we laid it out, and it went into actual printing and production from there. And my memory of this is, and maybe if someone else were here, they would correct me, but the Devo people had stepped on one or two in this large module of Gary's in-jokes. Now, Gary's a great guy, and I got to know him really well later and enjoyed him a lot. And I, at the time, didn't know or understand the kind of politics that he was going through there. But one of the things you didn't do to Gary's stuff was change his jokes. Now, as I recall, the one I remember that they changed was there was a guy in the module who was a non-player character who was the warder of something or other. It was warder, not warden. The Devo guys thought, well, that's a mistake. Clearly he hit R instead of N, so we'll change that. And they dutifully went through and fixed wherever that appeared. As it turned out, the difference between a warder and a warden for Gary was a big deal. Not only the fact that the warder was a tribute to his friend and my friend Jim Ward, but just the fact that the Devo people had touched his stuff, which he didn't want. So at that point, and my other friend Gene Wells, who was a good friend of Gary's, and who I'm happy to say I've been in touch with Gene several times recently after not hearing from her for more than 25 years. She was designing a module at the time called B3, and Gene and Gary were good friends. Gene did the Sage Advice column in Dragon magazine, and Gene and Gary had a famous tiff in which Gary argued that dwarf women had beards, and Gene argued that dwarf women did not have beards. That was disgusting, and it was all friendly, fun, and they enjoyed it a lot. So Gene and Gary were very close. Gary's edict came down from on high because apparently some other designers had said, these people are changing stuff that's in my module. And I have to admit that we were all guilty of that. I mean, like the first top secret module that I worked on, I put my wife's name, who's now my wife, then my girlfriend. I changed the name of the boat so that it was her name kind of twisted around and spelled backwards. And that was pretty common, so there was some basis for this complaint. But as I recall, the thing that set it off was warder becoming warden. The edict came down to our little group on the corner of Maine there, that editorially and in Devo, we were not to change what the designers wrote. We were not to do it. We were to put it out in print as it was designed and written. And of course, we were kind of upset about that because basically our job as the production editorial department was to make everything better. And I don't think there was really, aside from a few things we fixed and twiddled with, like Devo did, that we didn't need to, like we probably would have fixed Gordon if they hadn't. Aside from that, I think generally we did a really good job of doing that. And of safeguarding the company's interests, because we were all very interested we were gamers, and what we wanted was we wanted to put out the best possible games we could put out. And so we suddenly got this edict, and as I remember, it was also Len Lakofka, who I never met, was also part of this because he was having trouble getting a module through the design development Devo. So the order came down from on high that we were not, outside of the designers, especially Gary and his friends, we were not to touch anything. You could clean up the spelling, the grammar, and that kind of stuff, and we were going to put it out. That was the thing. Gene Wells, whom I love, was a big fan of the John Norman Gore series. Now, I may have read part of one book because she was my friend back then, but it was not something I was really into. It was a lot about this kind of muscular men and nearly naked women and soft bondage and all this kind of crazy stuff as I understand. So Jean was really into this, and she liked it a lot and thought that this kind of bondage stuff would be, you could use it in a module. I mean, there were days when bare breasts and talk of sex at TSR in modules is not a big deal. There was John Pickens, my roommate, who was maybe one of the most conservative people that you've ever want to meet in many ways, wrote an article in Dragon magazine called Orgies in D&D. And that was fine. Everyone thought it was fine. But things have switched. Now we're kind of starting to become a mass market company. And everyone was supposed to keep things clean and up. And this was starting to be around the time when James Dallas Egbert went off for his weekend with his friends, and everyone thought he was lost in the steam tunnels and all that kind of stuff. So B3 comes down through the editorial process. And it's got kind of a lot of bondage scenes in it. It has a scene where there's a woman tied up by her hair, hanging from the ceiling, being poked by men with swords. And while in some circumstances that might be good, harmless fun, the thought of the editorial and the thought of everyone in our building was, this is not, and even though Gene's our friend, this is not something we should really do. This is a bad idea. So in fact, it's such a bad idea that a number of the artists who were there at the time refused to work on it at all. They wouldn't do filler illustrations for this if we put this out, which is how friends of Gene, like me, ended up doing some artwork in that particular module. So it comes down, and I've one of my assets as an editor. I'm not the best proofreader or any of that kind of stuff, but I'm really good at organizing, and I'm good at moving through things at a rapid pace and getting them out the door. And though there wasn't a title that went with this, I've kind of become Harold Johnson's unofficial guy to not only do my own work, but to oversee some of the people in the department, like John Pickens and Ed Sollers, who were really good at their jobs, but were much more detail-oriented and would fall so far into editing something that they would miss their deadlines. So Ed Sollers was, as I recall, the guy that was the editor or the sub-editor on B3. He had the manuscript. And Ed's a guy from Texas, and I haven't seen him in years, and I wish I would. And Ed comes into my office one day, and I'm overseeing this project, and he says to me, "Steve," because that's the way Ed talked, he was from Texas, "Steve, this is bad. I mean, it's really bad. It has bondage and nudity and all this stuff. I mean, it's just bad." And I said, "Did you edit it, Ed?" He's like, "Well, I edited it, but it's bad." And I said, "Ed, we're under this edict that we are not to change the designer's intent in any of these models. They've told us that they will fire us if we change Warder to Warden again. Gary has approved this module as something that Gene could do, and Gene is Gary's friend. And we've hashed this out with her, and it's not going to change." She says, "But it's bad, Steve." And I'm like, "No, Ed, just put it through the system. Get it typeset, do the galleys, do the whole thing, and just run it like a normal module." You know, yes, the artists are refusing to work on it, but, you know, we've got Jim Rosloff and Bill Willingham, and I'm going to do some stuff, and Gene's done some pencil sketches of her own. We'll get it out the door, it'll be fine. No problem. Well, we did that. We took B3 and the kind of goldenrod color cover with the wonderful Errol Otis monster on the front, and we sent it out for production, and we got the usual number, thousands and thousands of them printed. And all of us thought, well, that's the end of that. We dodged that bullet. We did what they said. Well, that worked just about until that crossed the desk of one of the executives. And I don't know if it was one of the Blooms or it was one of the sale people or whatever. But they got to the point in that module where that woman is tied up, naked, tied up by her own hair, hanging from the ceiling, being poked from men with swords. And they just went zoom through the roof. They're trying to make D&D a family-friendly game, all this kind of stuff, and suddenly we got women tied up by their hair being poked with swords, among other things. That's the one that sticks out in my mind. It wasn't the only offender in the module. So at that point, they're like, "Look at these production people, what the hell have they done?" And they come storming down across town from the other offices, looking to fire people for this egregious offense, for Ed Sollers editing and me okaying and Harold stamping and everybody putting the sucker out. And they come down looking to get rid of all of us at that point. And we all just said, "Hey, here's the memo in which you say, do not change anything that the designer does, or we will fire you. We just did what you told us to do." And at that point, they were kind of, in best movie tradition, they were actually hoisted by their own petard at that point. They were like, well, we didn't kind of mean you shouldn't change anything. And they completely backed off the don't change anything. But as a result, they took that entire print run and destroyed it. They, as I recall, they were very secretive about this. They took it out and put most of them in a landfill. Now, some of the people who were in charge of destroying them did save a few of them. So there are some copies of the original D3 out there. And so far as I know, I am the only person anywhere in all the world to actually have an authorized edition of B3. And the way that I did that was, I'm pretty good as a talker. And it was the only thing that had my art in it. And I literally went to these people and I said, this is my only art. You may not get it in the next edition. And I did this whole long spiel where it was like, yeah, I needed to have just one for my copies. And amazingly, they relented. I'm sure none of them remember that. But in my house, tucked safe away, I have the only official